Stalin stared at the telegram, paralyzing fear mixing with his rage. The message was from Richard Sorge. The last time this spy sent a message, Stalin had thrown it in his intelligence chief's face, sneering, quote, "There's this bastard in Japan who reports the invasion date as June 22nd. Are you suggesting I should believe him?" That arrogance had cost Stalin 20 million Soviet lives. Because he didn't trust this German communist, Hitler's troops had crossed the border and tore through Soviet defenses like paper. Now, with the Wehrmacht visible from the Kremlin towers, Sorge was writing again. If this new intel was true, if that drunk womanizer was actually to be trusted, he might just be the one to save this war. Richard Sorge's transformation into a leading Soviet agent had an improbable beginning, not in Moscow, but as a devoted German soldier. Volunteering for the German army during World War I, he quickly established himself as a fierce combatant, until sustaining a severe injury. Shrapnel from artillery fire shattered his legs and ended his frontline duty and military career. What the injuries meant for his personal life and the war's senseless carnage radicalized him. During a long convalescence, Sorge immersed himself in the works of Karl Marx and other socialist thinkers. He later reflected, quote, "I decided not only to support the movement theoretically, but to become an actual part of it." By 1919, Sorge had earned a doctorate in political science and joined the German Communist Party. In the turmoil of post-war Germany, he witnessed workers' uprisings and fought against right-wing coups, honing skills in underground organization and guerrilla warfare. Sorge's dedication soon caught the attention of Soviet intelligence recruiters. In 1924, a Comintern official, Osip Pianitsky, noticed the capable young revolutionary and invited him to Moscow. Sorge officially became a member of the Soviet Communist Party and was enlisted in the International Liaison Department, which operated as a branch of Soviet intelligence. A committed and capable German national was exactly what the Soviets needed. By 1929, the Red Army's 4th Department brought him on as an agent, officially making the German veteran a Soviet spy. Unlike many spies who served for money or country, Sorge was among a rare breed of foreign communists who, as he would say, quote, "carried the passport of its enemies while flying the red flag in their hearts." He would soon be tested in the field, where his intellect, charm, and above all, his commitment to the cause would be pushed to the limit. By the early 1930s, Richard Sorge had proved himself in several European assignments and a posting in China. In Shanghai, he built an intelligence network and even recruited sources such as the famed American journalist Agnes Smedley and the Japanese writer Hotsumi Ozaki. His success under journalistic cover led Moscow to assign Sorge an even more challenging target, Imperial Japan. In 1933, the GRU ordered him to move to Tokyo and established a spy ring from scratch in that tightly policed society. Sorge was explicitly tasked to determine, quote, whether or not Japan was planning to attack the USSR. This question could define the entire future of the Soviet Union. Adopting the code name Ramsey, Sorge prepared to become what he hated the most, a fanatical Nazi journalist. To bolster the cover, Sorge did the unthinkable. He joined the German Nazi Party in 1933, despite being a known communist. This dangerous ruse required extraordinary nerve. He spent months in Germany carousing with Nazi colleagues and loudly espousing Hitler's ideology, all while secretly despising it. Sorge even quit drinking alcohol temporarily to ensure he never let slip his true loyalties in a beer hall conversation, saying, quote, "That was the bravest thing I ever did. Never will I be able to drink enough to make up for this time." The charade worked. Sorge so convincingly played the Nazi zealot that propaganda minister Joseph Goebbels himself attended his send-off dinner when he left for Japan in 1933. Armed with assignments from prestigious German newspapers like the Frankfurter Zeitung, Sorge arrived in Tokyo in September 1933, posing as a loyal German journalist and ardent anti-communist. Sorge thrived in Tokyo's expat circles, leveraging his wit, looks, and intellect to befriend key figures. One early conquest was Major General Eugen Ott, the German military attaché who became ambassador to Japan in 1938. Ott found the erudite, charismatic Sorge invaluable. They breakfasted together almost daily to discuss world affairs, and Sorge's deep knowledge of Japanese politics and China's war, knowledge unmatched by other Westerners, so impressed Ott that he treated Sorge as a top advisor. In fact, Sorge often drafted cables for Ott to send back to Berlin. The German ambassador trusted him so implicitly that he even used Sorge to courier secret messages across Asia. Not even a secret affair with Ott's wife aroused the ambassador's suspicion. Even after finding out about it, Ott let it slide. He called Sorge Richard the Irresistible due to his charm with women. Ott was unwilling to sever ties with a man he viewed as practically indispensable. Meanwhile, Sorge quietly built his spy network. He recruited brilliant locals and foreigners. Hotsu Miyazaki, a Japanese journalist with access to the Prime Minister's inner circle, Miyagi Yokotu, a journalist at an English-language paper, Branko Vukilic, a Yugoslav correspondent, and Max Clausen, a radio operator who relayed coded messages to Moscow. Under Sorge's leadership, this ring infiltrated the highest levels of both German and Japanese society. By the late 1930s, from his vantage point at the German embassy and Ozaki's contacts in Tokyo's halls of power, Richard Sorge became one of the Soviet Union's most valuable intelligence sources on the Axis powers. For example, during the Sino-Japanese War, Ott relied on Sorge's insights so heavily that embassy staff joked, quote, "Nothing went to Berlin that Sorge hadn't first seen." Sorge fed Moscow a steady stream of reports on Japan's intentions, Germany-Japan relations, and even internal Nazi directives, all under the noses of those who considered him a trusted colleague. His life in Tokyo was not without close calls. In May 1938, Sorge drunkenly crashed his motorcycle into a wall and was rushed to a hospital, carrying sensitive papers from Ozaki in his jacket. Had police examined his belongings, his cover might have been blown. Fortunately, a quick-thinking accomplice reached the hospital first and whisked away the incriminating documents. That same year, Japan and the USSR clashed in a border skirmish at Lake Khasan. Sorge reported back to Moscow that the battle had been started by overzealous Japanese officers and was not a prelude to full-scale war, reassuring his superiors that Tokyo had no immediate plans to invade Siberia. His assessment proved correct, and similar reports in 1939, during the larger Khalkhin-Gol conflict, indicated Japan still sought to avoid a broader war with Russia. But these prescient analyses were initially met with skepticism in Moscow. Stalin's secret police distrusted many of their own forward-deployed agents, especially cosmopolitan, quote, great illegals like Sorge, who had ties to ousted Soviet spy masters. Despite the distrust he faced, such as Moscow's ironic reprimand in September 1939 for supposedly failing to uncover Japan's war preparations, even though Sorge's intelligence was accurate, Sorge remained committed to his mission. His reports grew increasingly vital by 1940, as the Axis alliance became more consolidated. On December 18, 1940, Adolf Hitler signed Directive No. 21, codenamed Operation Barbarossa, ordering plans for a massive invasion of the Soviet Union in the coming year. Within days, Richard Sorge had obtained a copy of this top-secret directive and sent it to Moscow. It was an intelligence coup of the highest order. The Soviets were being alerted to Hitler's intent 6 months in advance. In early 1941, Sorge followed up with frequent updates as German forces massed in Eastern Europe. By May 1941, the reports grew urgent. On May 12th, Sorge warned that 150 German divisions were concentrating along the Soviet border. A few days later, through his contacts in the German embassy, he learned and reported the likely invasion date, June 21st or 22nd, 1941. Another anti-Nazi network in Europe, the Red Orchestra, led by Haro Schulze-Boysen, sent similar intelligence, corroborating Sorge's warnings. Yet in the Kremlin, Stalin brushed off these alarms. The Soviet leader was awash in warnings from various sources. Over 100 reports between January and June 1941 foretold a German attack, but Stalin refused to believe them. He'd convinced himself that Hitler, with whom he'd signed a non-aggression pact, would not risk a two-front war while Britain still resisted. Stalin suspected that British intelligence was behind many of the scare reports, aiming to provoke a Soviet-Nazi war. Even a direct warning delivered in Moscow by Germany's own ambassador, who privately confided that Hitler was preparing to invade, was cynically dismissed by Stalin as disinformation, planted by Winston Churchill. In Stalin's view, Sorge too might be a double agent or part of a British plot. There's this bastard who set up factories and brothels in Japan, and even deigned to report the date of the German attack as June 22nd. Are you suggesting I should believe him too? The Soviet dictator's paranoia about spies, especially foreign-born ones like Sorge with a German background, led him to ignore the very information that could have averted disaster. Undeterred, Sorge kept the warnings coming. On May 30th, 1941, he signaled to Moscow, quote, "Berlin informed Ott that German attack will commence in the latter part of June. Ott is 95% certain war will commence." A final message on June 20th reiterated, quote, "Ott told me that war between Germany and the USSR is inevitable, and that even Japan's general staff was already discussing the coming conflict." This was as precise and direct as Sorge could get. He was passing on the very chatter inside the German embassy. Sorge managed to name June 22nd exactly, but he was ignored. As dawn broke on June 22nd, 1941, Nazi Germany unleashed Operation Barbarossa. 3 million German and Axis troops surged across the Soviet border, catching many Red Army units completely off guard. When news of the invasion reached Tokyo, Richard Sorge was aghast. Even though he'd anticipated it for months, the reality of war shocked him. That day, a furious, heartsick Sorge drank himself into a stupor in a Tokyo bar, raving in English about Hitler's treachery. He shouted defiantly, quote, "Hitler's a criminal, a murderer, but Stalin will teach him a lesson. You just wait and see." Despite the crushing blow of his ignored warnings, Sorge remained loyal to Stalin. He recalled the disbelief bitterly, quote, "There were days when I sent 3 to 4 encryptions to Moscow, but it seems nobody believed me." In Moscow, the first hours of the invasion threw the Kremlin into panic and confusion. Stalin, stunned by the scale of the offensive he had denied was coming, initially could not bring himself to address the nation. As the Soviets reeled, Sorge's prior reports finally gained credibility, too late to prevent the devastating initial blow, but now seen as prescient. One Soviet account noted that only after the fact did, quote, Richard Sorge finally win Stalin's trust. It was a tragic vindication for the spy, validated only by the very catastrophe he tried to prevent. Even as the German invasion raged, Richard Sorge and his Tokyo aspiring kept working at a fever pitch. The second part of his mission, determining Japan's intentions, now took on dire urgency for the Soviet Union. By summer 1941, with Soviet armies in retreat, Stalin faced a nightmare scenario, a two-front war. If Japan attacked Siberia while Germany drove on Moscow, the USSR could be crushed between the pincers. For years, Japanese militarists had eyed Soviet territory in the Far East. Tens of thousands of Japanese troops of the Kwantung Army were stationed in Manchuria, poised near the Soviet border. Stalin had to know, would Tokyo strike north against him or south against other targets? The fate of Moscow might depend on the answer. Through July and August 1941, Sorge's man Ozaki tapped the high-level Japanese contacts for insight, while Sorge pressed Ambassador Ott for clues to German-Japanese strategy. On July 2nd, Japan's Imperial Conference, attended by Prime Minister Fumimaro Konoe, military chiefs, and even Emperor Hirohito, decided on a bold course: to seize European colonies in Southeast Asia, French Indochina, and beyond, even at the risk of war with the Western powers. At the same time, they agreed to reinforce troops in Manchuria in case a future opportunity arose to attack the USSR. Crucially, however, Japan had no immediate intention to fight the Soviets. Konoe and his cabinet leaned towards avoiding a northern war in 1941, preferring to focus on southern expansion. Sorge swiftly relayed these developments. In late June, he reported Japan's occupation of southern Indochina was imminent, and that for now, Konoe had decided on neutrality toward the Soviet-German war. In July, he warned that Nazi Foreign Minister Ribbentrop was pressuring Japan to attack the USSR, but, quote, the Japanese were resisting. Throughout August 1941, Sorge's messages grew more definitive. On August 25th, he sent a dispatch that Japan had decided not to launch war against the Soviets, quote, within this year. Repeat, not to launch the war this year. A few weeks later, on September 14th, 1941, Richard Sorge transmitted what would become his most consequential report, quote, in the careful judgment of all of us here, the possibility of Japan launching an attack, which existed until recently, has disappeared. Japan will not attack the Soviet Union until 1. Moscow had been captured, 2. The Kwantung Army had become 3 times the size of Soviet Far Eastern forces, 3. A civil war had started in Siberia. In other words, as long as the Soviets continued to resist and Moscow stood, Japan would hold off. This was effectively a guarantee that the Soviet Far East was safe from invasion for the rest of 1941. Unlike his earlier Barbarossa warnings, Sorge's September intelligence was heated in Moscow. By this point, Stalin's once dismissed German journalist had proven right about Hitler's treachery, and the Red Army desperately needed every advantage. Soviet intelligence chiefs now vouched for Sorge's reliability. One senior staffer announced his report, noting that given Sorge's past accuracy and good sources, quote, this information can be trusted. Stalin thus made a fateful decision. He ordered dozens of divisions from Siberia and the Far East to be railed westward to reinforce the defenses of Moscow. This redeployment would have been unthinkable had Japan loomed as an immediate threat. But thanks to Sorge's tip, Stalin took the calculated risk of stripping his eastern flank to save the capital. By early December 1941, as temperatures plunged and the German advance slowed, fresh Siberian units, tough, winter-hardened troops under General Zhukov's command, bolstered the Soviet lines around Moscow just in the nick of time. On December 5th, 1941, these reinforcements spearheaded a sudden counteroffensive that shocked the Germans. Hitler's Wehrmacht, overstretched and ill-equipped for the brutal cold, was driven back from Moscow's suburbs in the Red Army's first major victory of the war. The Battle of Moscow became the Third Reich's first strategic defeat. Contemporaries and historians have since credited Richard Sorge's intelligence as a decisive factor in this victory. By making possible the transfer of the Siberian divisions, Sorge's information, quote, might have been the most important military intelligence work of World War II. Some even argue that Sorge saved Moscow when all seemed lost. This may be a simplification of a complex battle, but there's no doubt that without those additional troops, Moscow's defense would have collapsed. Tokyo's decision to attack Pearl Harbor and Southeast Asia, as Sorge had foreseen, relieved Stalin and confirmed Sorge was the most valuable intelligence asset he had. Yet, right during the height of his spy career, Sorge was already in grave peril. By autumn 1941, his radio signals and sub-agents' activities had drawn the net of Japanese counterintelligence ever tighter around his ring. In one of his last messages to Moscow, sent in October, he boldly volunteered to return to Europe to continue spying on Nazi Germany, since Japan was unlikely to attack the USSR. But it was not to be. The Kempeitai, Japanese military police, had intercepted enough mysterious radio traffic to suspect an espionage network in Tokyo. They also noticed that German diplomatic secrets were leaking, pointing to a possible mole in the embassy. Japanese suspicions had increasingly focused on the gregarious German reporter in their midst, Richard Sorge. In October 1941, the spy game was up. Japanese authorities first arrested one of Sorge's lesser-known associates, Yotoku Miyagi, who cracked when violently interrogated and identified Sorge and others as spies. With this intelligence, the Kempeitai set a trap for Sorge himself. They deployed a female informant, codenamed Kiyomi, to get close to him. One evening, as Sorge dined with his new lover at a restaurant, a waiter discreetly dropped a tiny rice paper note on their table, a warning from one of Sorge's friends that his arrest was imminent, urging him to flee immediately. Realizing the danger, Sorge excused himself and rushed to a car with Kiyomi. He tried to burn the note with his lighter. When it faltered, he asked Kiyomi for a light, but she claimed not to have one. Frustrated, Sorge tossed the half-burnt paper out the window and sped off. Kiyomi then pleaded to stop at her parents' home briefly, in reality calling her handlers to retrieve the discarded note. The charred scrap was recovered, still legible enough to incriminate Sorge. The hunter had been outwitted by a counter-spy. In the early hours of October 18th, 1941, Richard Sorge was arrested in Tokyo. He'd spent his last night of freedom characteristically in the arms of Ambassador Ott's wife, unaware it would be his last fling. When the Kempeitai came for him, Sorge did not resist. The Japanese informed Ambassador Ott that his trusted friend was accused, quote, on suspicion of espionage. Ott was flabbergasted, insisting it had to be a mistake or Japanese espionage hysteria, saying, quote, Sorge a spy? What twaddle. I would put my hand in the fire for that man. Another German acquaintance marveled at Sorge's skills, quote, considering that he managed to conceal his identity up until now, I have to say he was an exceptional man. Indeed, Sorge had fooled them all, but now the spy master was in enemy hands. Under brutal interrogation, Sorge initially stonewalled. The Japanese suspected him of being an Abwehr agent, which Berlin flatly denied. Eventually, relentless beatings and the psychological strain took their toll. Sorge confessed to being a Soviet agent, risking execution, but hoping he could turn it into leverage. Ever the negotiator, Sorge struck a deal. He promised to tell the Japanese everything he knew if the Kempeitai agreed to spare the lives of his lover, Hanoko Ishii, and the wives of his fellow agents. Remarkably, the Japanese honored this bargain. Ishii, whom Sorge truly loved, was never arrested, and the other spouses were left unharmed. True to his word, Sorge provided a full account of his espionage activities. Even in confession, a note of pride slipped through, quote, that I successfully approached the German embassy in Japan and won absolute trust there was the foundation of my organization. Even in Moscow, my spying activity is evaluated as having no equivalent in history. Sorge couldn't help reminding them just how extraordinary his accomplishment had been. A diplomatic dance played out over his fate. Japan and the USSR were not at war, so the Japanese quietly approached Moscow with offers to exchange Sorge for one of their own agents. They did so not once, but 3 times. Each time, the Soviet government bluntly replied that it knew of, quote, no such person as Richard Sorge. Stalin coldly abandoned his master spy. The reasons remain murky, but historians surmise that Stalin could neither forgive Sorge's breach of silence under interrogation, nor forget that Sorge had been close to Soviet officials, purged in the late 1930s. In Stalin's eyes, Sorge's arrest merely confirmed old suspicions that he must have been untrustworthy after all. In a final twist of cruelty, the Soviet dictator even had Sorge's estranged wife, Ekaterina, arrested in Moscow as a German spy and sent to the Gulag, where she lost her life in 1943. Such was Stalin's paranoia that even the hero who likely saved Moscow was expunged from Soviet recognition. On November 7th, 1944, the 27th anniversary of the Bolshevik Revolution, Richard Sorge was led to the gallows in Tokyo's Sugamo prison. He was 49 years old. At that moment, Sorge displayed the same fearless fervor that had defined his life. With the noose around his neck, he shouted his final words in Japanese, quote, "Long live the Red Army, the International Communist Party, the Soviet Communist Party." Richard Sorge's name was all but erased in the USSR, an embarrassing reminder of Stalin's lapses and injustices. Meanwhile, in the West, in Japan, his exploits became the stuff of legend. Journalists and intelligence experts hailed him as a spy prodigy. Britain's Christopher Andrew ranked him, quote, among the greatest spies of the century. Novels and films were inspired by his story, including a 1961 French film called Who Are You, Mr. Sorge? Ironically, it was that film, viewed by Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev, which finally brought Sorge belated honor in his homeland. Shocked to learn that the man depicted was real and had been ignored, Khrushchev ordered an investigation. In 1964, Pravda published an article lauding Sorge as a symbol of, quote, devotion, courage, and heroism in the fight against fascism. The article frankly admitted that Sorge had provided a detailed warning of Hitler's attack, only to have Stalin disregard it. Pravda lamented that had Stalin heeded Richard Sorge, quote, how many thousands and millions of lives would have been saved. On November 5th, 1964, the Soviet government posthumously awarded Richard Sorge the highest honor, the title of Hero of the Soviet Union. His lover, Hanoko Ishii, was granted a pension for her role in aiding him. Monuments now stand in Baku and Moscow to commemorate the legendary Soviet intelligence officer who fooled Germany and Japan. Still others recall him as a complex, morally damaged individual. Some who knew him recall the, quote, swashbuckling, arrogant Nazi persona he donned in public, while privately he remained a disciplined communist agent. British officers in World War II grudgingly acknowledged Sorge's coup in unmasking Hitler's invasion plans. The famed MI6 spy master Friedrich Jedburgh reportedly said that if the Soviets had a dozen more like Richard Sorge, quote, the war might have ended much sooner.